China, the long march. No retreat, no retreat. The long march began at nightfall. The troops left in separate contingents, in a blustering October wind which threatened rain. In front were two army groups under Lin Biao and Peng De, warning villages and checking the areas ahead. Then more formations began to move, soon merging into an army of 3 columns, with porters, camp followers, and a baggage train in the middle. A mass of more than 80,000 people spreading along some 60 miles of route. It was more than an army on the move. With them were printing presses, a mint, sewing machines for uniforms, an enormous store of documents, costumes, and equipment for the theatre group, chests of silver dollars and banknotes. Many thought they would be on the move for only a week or two before finding a new base. The marchers were mostly men in their 20s. Many were veterans of guerrilla warfare and well-trained in killing. Most were from very poor families and felt they had nothing to lose by joining the communists. Many had been recruited from villages in the communist-controlled areas. Apart from the soldiers, there were party officials, civilian porters to carry baggage, and 35 women, including the wives of the leaders. All the children, including those of Mao Zedong and his wife, He Zhejian, had to be left behind with peasant families. Those born on the march had also to be left with villages. Despite exhaustive searches after the march, an infant son born to He Zhejian during the march was never found. Zhou Enlai's wife, Deng Yingchao, was ill with tuberculosis during much of the march. Zhu De's wife, Kang Keqing, was as tough and cheerful as her husband and played a great role urging on stragglers and placing the wounded in peasants' care. Thin and hollow-eyed, Mao nearly died from malaria. Party leaders and some of the sick were provided with horses, which were always in short supply. There was no wheeled transport. The rank and file were heavily laden. As well as his rifle, if he had one, a man carried 5 pounds of rice. From his shoulder pole hung either 2 boxes of ammunition or, if he was an engineer, kerosene cans filled with essential machinery, parts or tools. His pack contained a blanket and winter uniform and spare pairs of strong cloth shoes or plated sandals, sometimes tipped and heeled with metal. As the march continued, clothing and equipment changed. When there were no villages or towns and no supplies, some struggled on barefoot and in rags. In rich areas, they flourished and re-equipped themselves. In places where straw hats were made, they secured big hats made of bamboo and oiled paper. Sometimes they got hold of raincoats made of cloth treated with tung oil, or umbrellas, useful in rain but torn to shreds in hail. Daily rations were carried in a large tin cup filled with layers of rice and vegetables. Many adolescent boys served in the ranks. They ran messages, foraged for food, and tended the wounded. The initial breakout was well concealed, with local partisans taking over from regular units at defence positions on the perimeter. For days, even weeks, the Kuomintang government in Nanjing was not sure what had happened. The communists broke out to the southwest, where the troops facing them were from Guangdong province, ostensibly allies of the government, but no great friends of Chiang Kai-shek. They were ready to fight because they feared invasion of their homeland and despoiling of fields and granaries. When Zhou Enlai's emissary assured them that the communists meant only to cross on their way northwest, the Guangdong soldiers proffered only token resistance. Within 3 weeks, the communists had penetrated 2 encircling enemy lines. 10 days later, they were through the 3rd, where the Guangzhou-Hankou railway line runs. They often marched at night to avoid Kuomintang air attacks. A Red Army officer recalled, "Night marching is wonderful if there is a moon and a gentle wind blowing. When no enemy troops were near, whole companies would sing and others would answer. We made torches from pine branches or frayed bamboo. When at the front of a mountain, we could look up and see a long column of lights coiling like a fiery dragon up the mountainside. From the summit, we would look in both directions and see miles of torches. A rosy glow hung over the whole line of march." But marching at night was too slow to shake off the pursuing Kuomintang forces. The communists soon had to move by day as well. With the enemy air raids, we were always scattering and lying down, and then getting up and marching till the next raid came, said a survivor. Losses were heavy. The first serious obstacle to their progress was the Xiang River, about 250 miles west of the breakout. The river was shallow, and forward units waded across without much trouble. But then resistance stiffened. Local troops mistakenly saw the marchers as a threat to the city of Guilin and fought like tigers. Kuomintang divisions moved in from the flanks. The Red Army was split in 2 by the river, and the rear units were slowed down by the heavy baggage train. A tough, bloody battle lasted 5 days. The surviving communist forces crossed the river and fought their way clear, but the cost was appallingly high. Battered and reduced, the Red Army divisions moved along the northern borders of Guangxi province, keeping to the mountains to avoid enemy attack. The going was extremely hard. Sometimes the rough tracks petered out altogether. Advance troops were slowed by the terrain. Those in the rear would take a few steps forward and then have to wait in their columns, unable to rest. A captain recalled, "Men fell asleep on their feet." The crossing of Laoshan, it means Old Mountain, was something no soldier forgot. Rough steps had been cut out of the mountain's steep face, but climbing in the dark was a nightmare. The order came to stay where we were until daybreak, said a man who took part. I slept rolled in my blanket on a pathway, 2 feet wide on the edge of an abyss. Now they struck northwest, only to face more trouble. Chiang Kai-shek had guessed that they might try to link up with Herlong's Soviet and had barred the way with many well-armed divisions. If he managed to outflank and encircle them, their losses might be enormous. Yet there seemed to be no alternative to punishing doggedly north and paying whatever blood price the link-up would cost. It was Mao and his supporters who argued forcefully against the plan. Surely it was better to push on westwards, even with no precise objective, than to walk into this Kuomintang trap. Mao's view prevailed, and so the whole direction and extent of this great communist retreat were changed. Although at that time the Red Army had no accurate knowledge of areas where other communist forces might be in control, they were now committed to a truly long march, which would take them 1,000 miles to the west, and then north, far from the homelands of most of the soldiers. Vague plans to set up a less remote Soviet area would be abandoned. Moving west, this First Front Army, as they were called, approached the mountains of Gweijou. This was the province cited in many proverbs for its barrenness and poverty. When a Gweijou family wanted fish for dinner, went one story, the father drew a fish on the wall, and the children sat around and used their imagination. The whole province boasted not 1 pound of silver, not 1 pound of rice, nor, as the marchers were soon to confirm, 1 level yard of ground. Even Ju De was shocked at the poverty of the peasants' huts, at the sight of girls working naked in the fields. The Gweijou provincial forces were opium smokers and poorly led, which was just as well for the communists, who badly needed a respite. They had suffered devastating losses in the first month of the march. Hardly a day had passed without a skirmish, and the Kuomintang's bombers had pursued them relentlessly. By any normal army command assessment, theirs was a very serious situation. Of an army of some 80,000 members, only about half were still on the march. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or deserters, apart from some propaganda units, so-called dragon's teeth, left behind in the villages and towns along the route to spread the communist message and recruit supporters. It was a fearful roll call. How did the Communist Party leaders sustain the Long March, maintaining control over their men and preventing them from disintegrating into a rabble bent only on personal escape? Partly it was because the marchers had more to lose by running than by accepting the Red Army command. The enemy took no prisoners. Partly it was due to the relationship between Red Army officers and their men. Many high-ranking communist officers were formerly members of the Kuomintang and had been trained in the famous military academy at Huangpu near Guangzhou. However, management of the Red Army was along communist lines. An officer must never strike a soldier. No commander dared to use army supplies for private business. Every unit had a so-called Revolutionary Soldiers Committee to maintain morale, organize communist teaching, and handle complaints. And in the companies, especially tough and dedicated men, the political officers, made up a hard-fighting backbone. It was they who mostly survived the march. Communist discipline was observed at close hand by a Swiss missionary, Alfred Bosshardt, who, with his wife and a colleague, was captured by Red Army units and forced to march with them. This was a lesser force commanded by 25-year-old General Xiao Ke, with Ren Bishou as his commissar. It had broken out of the Kuomintang encirclement around Jiangxi back in August 1934 and was on its way to join up with General He Long's Second Front Army. Bosshardt's wife was released, but Bosshardt himself had to stay with the communists for 27 days of ceaseless marching. He noted how everyone in the marching column had his precise place. This meant that even when disaster loomed, there was never any panic. It was a special kind of coordinated discipline that enabled an army of mostly illiterate peasants to survive against apparently overwhelming odds. The marching order was maintained even in the dark. When concealment was necessary, the lights were doused and the army marched in silence, each man with a hand on the shoulder of the comrade in front of him. As the long column wound on over the mountains, scouts ranged far ahead, marking paths for the main body. The vanguard was the fighting force, but when it met serious opposition, the whole army retreated and sought another way round. Once the column found itself back in a village it had left a week before. They pushed themselves to the limit to gain the benefit of surprise. Often they arrived at a defended town when the garrison thought them to be still 50 miles away. The communists took the most inaccessible mountain tracks to escape attack, Bosshardt recalled, and the going was extremely hard. He remembered his impression of an endless succession of razor-backed peaks as he limped along, half crippled with exhaustion. Even tough peasant soldiers wept with the pain of their limbs after a long day's march. Footwear was the soldier's daily concern and obsession. If he couldn't march, he would fall behind, and that was likely to mean his death. No one had leather boots. Some wore plated sandals, often in need of repair and replacement. The men with whom Bosshardt marched wore cloth tied to their bare feet with string or straw. In wet weather, a pair of sandals fell to pieces in a day's marching, and whenever they halted, the soldiers began making fresh sandals with cloth taken from the landlords' houses along the line of march. When they were ahead of the game, men marched with a spare pair of sandals slung over their shoulders. The landlords were their prey. Landlords were defined as anyone employing servants or farm labourers. Their houses were ransacked and their crops commandeered. Landlords in the towns were fined, and their heads hacked off if the fines were not paid before the army moved on. Stealing from common people was forbidden. One story relates how part of a column sheltered from air attack in a grove of pomelos. Pomelos are a large citrus fruit. Although the men were half crazed with hunger and thirst, the fruit remained untouched because nobody was sure whether the owner was a landlord or a peasant. Finally, a village woman arrived and began selling fruit to the troops. Bosshardt's unit finally linked up with He Long at the end of October 1934. Bosshardt tried to slip away when the guards were not looking. Betrayed by a peasant, he faced a people's court and a death sentence. But when told to spell out his name to the watching crowd, The strange foreign sounds of the letters set off gales of laughter, and that saved his life. He was finally released after further months of rough treatment and sickness. Herlong's army, the Second Front Army, stayed in northwest Hunan for several months, harassing provincial forces. This eased the dangers for the Central Red Army columns as they toiled westwards into Gweijou in the summer of 1934. Now the marchers changed tactics. Instead of advancing in a straight line, which made them easy targets for aircraft, they began a series of maneuvers aimed at confusing the enemy. 2 and sometimes 4 columns followed independent routes, separate from the main body of the army, while the vanguard would sometimes split in 2 in a pincer movement. Much of the heavier baggage and equipment had by now been abandoned. When, in December 1934, the communists took the town of Liping in eastern Gweizhou province, they halted and regrouped before pressing on across the broad Wu River to capture the quiet town of Zunyi. According to some accounts, they took the town by subterfuge without firing a shot. They rested for 12 days, spread propaganda in the villages, and won several thousand recruits. Party leaders held a conference, an extended Politburo meeting. The decisions they reached were to have a far-reaching effect on the destinies of both the party and later of all China.